Thank you very much for coming. It's a great pleasure. My name is IVAN KRASTEV. I'm the permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, who is one of the co-organizers of this event. And Jonathan White is the author of In the Long Run. He's a political theorist. He's teaching in London School of Economics. We just joke that I'm not going to tell you anything more because from time to time people are presenting people who are speaking in the way they're looking for a job, telling everything that they have. This is not his case. But also it's quite important that future attracts people. What I'm going to do is just make one point, because I had the privilege together with Lenny Bernardo to review the book, to tell you what the book was so important for me. And then it's very much up to Jonathan to go and to make the argument. Probably we're going to exchange 2 or 3 questions, and we're going to have 20 minutes for your questions. Listen, the story of what happened to the future is the biggest criminal story and criminal mystery that we have these days. Has it vanished? Has the future been killed? By whom, when, and why? And even the last Vienna Humanities, we have the presentation of Jan Zelonka, The Future Lost. There is something very powerful and original in this book. And the major argument, at least I'm reading it, and I could be totally wrong, and this is why Jonathan is here, is that there is a specific understanding of the future, both near and distant future, open and closed, depending on this, that makes democracy possible. So in the way people before said that democracy cannot really survive if you don't have an income of this and that money, he basically said, based on what kind of idea we have the future, democratic regime can flourish or democratic regime is at risk. So I'm going to stop here with my interpretation or misinterpretation and go to Jonathan.
Thank you, Ivan, and thank you for having me here to talk about the book. Yeah, this is indeed the heart of the book. It's a book which has a tortoise on the cover, which I guess speaks to some of these themes of how much time is felt to be available in politics, in society, at any particular moment, and what that implies for how democracy is done or how it becomes possible. And I guess the basic thought, picking up on what Ivan has just said, that democracy somehow relies on a certain relationship to the future, is that modern democracy is representative democracy. In other words, we live in a world where democracy is not the direct democracy of the Athenian Forum, where people aspire to have a kind of immediate, unmediated influence over how decisions are taken, but we live in a world of procedures, of representatives, of some who have to act on behalf of others, some kind of distinction between rulers and ruled. And of course, that's never very satisfactory. With that come a whole range of problems, ways in which, for example, not everything can be represented at once, not all interests can be represented by government at once, not all values, not all concerns, not all identities. And so there's a kind of a deep, perhaps, frustration or something unsatisfactory that comes with a form of democracy that is dependent on these types of structures of mediation, as everything around us in the modern world is. And I guess one of the leading thoughts of the book is that one way this has been at least semi-bearable in modern politics is to have this relationship between the dissatisfactions of the present and some notion of the future to come, in which they can be ameliorated, perhaps corrected. So if an election happens, and of course elections happen quite regularly and they're imminent in some parts of the world today, when an election happens, sometimes they are won by those that we are not sympathetic to and we may be deeply hostile to.
So you'll probably know some of the polls here, yeah?
Yeah. And when that happens, clearly, in line with those polls, you have to have some reason to stay in the game, to accept the rules, everything that comes with representative democracy, as I've just been saying, losers' consent, as the political scientists call it, why those who lose in some in some fashion with any particular electoral outcome or any decision generally in politics, accept that outcome. And I think for many, as I say, the answer, either spelt out explicitly or implicitly understood, is there is another time, there is a next time, there is some future moment in which the problems of any particular political outcome can be addressed. And in coming at this question today, I think it's always interesting to study things when they seem to be in crisis, any kind of concept, any concern. And as Ivan said in his introduction, perhaps there is a sense in which the future is in crisis today. We live in a world where we often encounter deadlines, climate deadlines, economic deadlines, the deadlines set by economic interests, by international institutions and so on. The sense of finite time, the sense of time running out, or the sense of a critical window in which certain things have to be done correctly, where mistakes cannot be afforded. This creates this sense of, to use a term which I borrow, temporal claustrophobia, of the future closing in on the present, and interrupts exactly what I was referring to a moment ago, that sense that representative democracy works insofar as it can kind of draw legitimacy from the future. So this is, I guess, one of the organizing thoughts of the book, theoretically, that democracy has this relationship to future instances of elections, of contestation, of being able to make mistakes at any one moment because there'll be another time. And yet we live in a time where perhaps confidence in that is waning. And that's something that I also go into the book about. But that's, I guess, generally the point of departure for the book. And then to set that in a bit of historical context, how these ideas emerged around democracy and how we got to the point today where we seem to be less willing to invoke that future with confidence.
Thank you very much. Because the interesting story is, and because his previous work, I mean Jonathan's, was very much on the politics of emergency. And if you have the politics of emergency, you don't have the right to make a mistake. And this is making the situation so difficult. If you basically have the mentality of survivors, you cannot function under democratic conditions. And I'm saying this because, at least for me, the paradox of democracy is the following. And we spent the summer on the Black Sea coast. I'm Bulgarian, as you know. And we have been staying with a very close friend of mine who is a theater director. And we have been discussing the possibility for a play in which two different ideas of the future meets. So listen, look at Elon Musk. By the way, the market is totally about the future. His money are made by the purchases of the people who probably are not born yet, who are going to buy the cars who has not produced yet. There is no any type of a rational connection. This is true for every technological company. There are people who know market better than me, but in a certain way, everybody who is buying the shares of be it Tesla or anybody else are living in the future, totally. And then you have the other idea of the future, which was, there was a person who probably only East Europeans of you remember, but there was a very important miner in the 1930s in Soviet Union who managed basically to do the 5-year plan for 14 months or something like this. Takhanov, it was a great movement and so on. So he was also living in the future because basically he was producing this and that. So our idea was what's going to happen if these two are going to meet today? And what they're going to discuss between themselves. And I'm saying this because part of the story is that we became very apocalyptic, but part of the story is that future has disappeared because we are consuming it all the time. We are consuming as a debt in economic terms. We are consuming it because basically we are doing this. And even, by the way, if you see how we are moving, we all the time are now much more moving, not in space, but in time. And here comes my second question, because Jonathan, if it was me, I was going to stop here, asking the question. But he's a much more responsible person than me. So he was trying to give an answers, what can be done. And we have been slightly more critical with Lenny on the answer than on the question. So I do believe it's very important how you're seeing getting out of the situation in which everybody behaves like the last man. Some fear climate, Some fear, by the way, demography. Probably I'm not the last man, but I'm the last Bulgarian. So how you're going to deal with this? How basically you're returning the future in politics, keeping in mind that for the left, the future was as important as religion for the right. So what is the trick that you're going to suggest?
Okay, so yeah, this is something I try and engage with in the book. And so insofar as one arrives at this present I've characterized as one in which there is a sort of skepticism, a loss of confidence in the future with all the political implications I've mentioned. Clearly many explanations of that are possible, and one firmly goes down the economic route, the way in which we have hemmed ourselves in, I guess, as part of capitalist societies that rely on debt, borrowing from the future, that narrow the range of policy choices accordingly, which also perhaps bring a sense of the impotence of political actors to do very much in the face of emergencies left, right, and center. This book, though, I guess also wants to pair that without necessarily negating that story with another one about changes within politics itself, because it seems to me that political parties, movements, trade unions, in some ways have been the ways in which people have achieved a slimmer of hope, confidence about the future in decades gone past. We as individuals, of course, know that our lifespan is finite, and that what we can't achieve in our own lives potentially will be left undone. But insofar as people were able to join some kind of collective and to think collectively with other people about how the future might look, exercise some kind of imaginative impulse towards the future as members of a left-wing party, a liberal party, a green party, possibly also a far-right party. We can come back to specificities of these different orientations perhaps later. But insofar as one could align with some kind of project that was ongoing, lifetime transcending, I guess one might say, then perhaps one had a reason for a little bit of confidence about the future beyond simply what one as an individual might hope to achieve. And of course, we live in a world where all those kind of collectives perhaps are weaker, seem to be less attractive to certainly many young people, but also many older people as well. And so there's a part of this book which I think is very much about how is it that those organs, if you like, of longer-term confidence for the willingness to sort of project beyond this election, perhaps even beyond the next election, several elections down the line, the sense of an enduring cause was something that was offered by these types of collectives in politics. As they get weaker, likewise, perhaps one can expect that focus on the immediate, the emergency, the last chance becomes all the stronger. So some of the later parts of the book are about if we really want to find ways to counter this sense of finality that seeps into democracy everywhere, then I think it's going to have to be something about changing exactly these organs of representation, parties, movements, organizing them in such a way that they are not dominated by, if you like, the most short-termist amongst them, political leaders who care about re-election, who care about very much the next encounter. But those other members of political parties who often join it because they do have some kind of lingering ideals, visions, things that they want to carry on beyond their immediate self-interests. You had more of them in charge of political collectives rather than the more managerial forms of politics that tend to dominate, then arguably you'd have a slightly different way of inviting people to find confidence in representative democracy today. So the final parts of the book, exactly as you say, are some ideas about what it might mean to re-democratize political parties, connect them to social movements. Of course, these are in some sense, eternal problems of modern politics to which I can't pretend to have the answer, nor do I even necessarily have full confidence that this is a viable possibility, that these things can be democratized. But I certainly want to make the connection between the two, because I think it is misleading to suppose that we can kind of renovate democracy in its current forms without being attentive to its relationship to the future and how it has relied on political parties and movements to generate that confidence in the future. Lose one and I think you lose both together. So again, this comes out of other work I've done on party democracy and its significance.
This is interesting because in my view there's three factors that make it difficult, and I'm going to be interested in your view on this. One is very much about the changing understanding of mortality. Listen, if you go to Silicon Valley, you're going to see really a lot of people who believe that they're going to live forever. No, but I'm not saying this in an ironic tone, because they're putting billions in this. They have a different idea how they're going to achieve it, but suddenly, probably more than in any other period of human history I know, you have people for whom not dying is becoming a kind of a practical question. By the way, you'll probably remember Woody Allen has this famous sentence. He said, "I want to live, but not in the heart of the people, but in my apartment." And this kind of a story is something that is really, really happening. At the same time, we have things like nations, religions, political parties. That was the way we have been fighting against mortality of the individual. For example, I'm going to die in a revolution, and I know that I'm never going to die. Or at least they're going to put me in a mausoleum. I'm saying this because suddenly we start to believe that probably nations are more mortal than individuals. And this is also changing. The other kind of a factor that is coming is demography. I'm always asking my question, and probably this is what Mr. Trump had in mind when he was talking about childless ladies with cats. But the biggest story is to what extent the relations between generations is changing. To what extent, for example, my grandmother was the 12th kid in a family, and we have two. To what extent this is changing your perspective on the future? To what extent basically wanting to live through the lives of your kids, which was very particularly important for the generation of my parents and so on and so on. So this is the second thing that I'm asking to you, to what extent this is not such a cultural change that returning the role of the visionary political parties and so on. And the third is an argument that I have read years ago. There was American sociologist Daniel Bell, who in the 1970s wrote this book on the cultural contradictions of capitalism. And he made a point which always stayed with me, and he said, listen, capitalism works very well with the people who are not produced by capitalism. He said the saving person was produced by the Protestant kind of a tradition, which was not capitalist. The real capitalist person is a borrowing man. So suddenly, by the way, as I said, I'm Bulgarian and I have been very much socialized before 1989. And back then the story was that socialism does not work well because there is not enough socialist people. Now probably the problem of capitalism is the opposite. Probably part of the problem that we see is that capitalism managed to produce in a certain type of a consumer who wants to consume the future immediately. In the way, basically, you try also to consume the future of your own kids. And this is why, for me, the really political question, and I don't have an answer, and this is why I really respect for people who dare to try to give strategies even when they know how easy it is for people on a panel to criticize them. In practical terms, I very much agree with you that democracy is preconditioned on certain understanding of the future and a certain type of future. Practically, how you're moving it?
So on the question first of immortality, I think this is very interesting because in some sense it's a kind of reversal of the story 200 years ago, very crudely put, which was in a world of what seemed like enduring secularization, people move from a kind of belief in the afterlife. I'm speaking very quickly here. There's clearly a huge amount of historiography on this question. But if a belief in the afterlife, in Christian terms of the immortality of the soul, starts to wane or comes in question from the Reformation onwards, then you might say that it's no surprise then that one has the emergence of collectives, whether it's nations, whether it's parties, ideological projects which kind of substitute for that and promise a certain kind of enduring cause, some kind of political immortality to take the place of the waning religious immortality. And I guess, picking up on your thought here, are we living perhaps in a world where precisely the opposite dynamics start to kick in, that precisely personal immortality becomes foreseeable? I mean, I would say this is, for me, not a widespread sentiment of the present. It's present in Silicon Valley. It's present amongst a hyper-rich minority within Silicon Valley, but perhaps we see the pioneers of a sentiment which brings back the idea of individual immortality precisely at a time when collective mortality, parties that die, personification, as we used to talk about in the 2010s, parties that have been around for a century seeming perhaps to be on their very last legs. So there is an interesting kind of interplay between these two, and it is almost the very opposite of that which created space for modern ideological politics 200 years ago that we're seeing today. On generational questions, on demographic questions, I mean, I'm always a bit wary of trying to read too much from social facts into political realities. This is clearly an argument that one often hears. We live in aging societies, greying societies, societies in which increasing numbers of people have only so many years left to live. Why would we expect them to be particularly interested in the further future in politics, again, in awareness of their own personal situation? It always seems to me one can read exactly the same social facts in many different ways. Another way to put it perhaps would be that we live in societies with increasing numbers of grandparents, increasing numbers of people who have descendants, the capacity to put a face on the future, you might say, the capacity to see the future through their own lineage. And you might say, well, does this not exactly inspire precisely opposite concerns, to care about I think this is very much what a lot of people do feel, however old they may be, that they know that they are part of community societies which have long-term stakes in politics and can see those through their relationship to kin. And so, to the extent that we live in societies of more and more grandparents, I presume this is true. I mean, maybe there's some reason why one cannot infer that from the generational spread that we see today. But insofar as that is true, it seems to me it shouldn't necessarily be read as feeding directly into a kind of political short-termism, a presentism of politics. And then finally, I guess the thought again is, do we live in a sort of a world beyond ideology, a world in which many people have been made through capitalism to want immediate gratification, to be less high-minded, to be all about pursuing interests in some direct and tangible fashion? I think, again, so many of these tendencies produce their counter-tendency. Yes, we live in a world where many of us have that sensibility, but I think almost everyone is a divided soul on exactly this kind of question. Yes, is encouraged through education systems to think about targets, to think about success in ways that you can quantify, that you can put a number on, and that then feeds into the quantification of success in terms of your bank account and the quantification of failure in similar terms, and the willingness to bring this as the yardstick into politics and to reward those that seem to promise some type of tangible rewards within the electoral cycle. But at the same time, it seems to me that so much about contemporary politics is about the opposite of that, about the repudiation of a politics of simply immediate gratification, of wanting something more than that. And I think you see this on left and right. I think you see it in very problematic terms on the right, as people precisely decry a kind of technocratic politics of adding a little bit to GDP, adding a little bit to even numbers which are closer to home, but which seem to be, at some level meaningless, or at some level very hard to experience. They are susceptible to a kind of economic gaze, but not to a experiential understanding. You see that on the right, I think, as people support parties that in no way seem to promise economic gratification, and perhaps even make some claim about, we stand here, we're not going to promise you that much, but we're going to bring a bit of agency, a bit of volition into politics. We're going to do what we want to do. We're going to keep immigrants out because that's what we want to do. And if that makes us all a bit poorer, at least we're doing something that we want to do. That is a kind of repudiation of a very dangerous kind of the capitalist attitude that you're describing. Perhaps there might also be more attractive repudiations of the same mentality, where it would be kind of green ecological projects of transforming society, not just so as to hit certain types of carbon deadlines, but also so as to make a better society in the process of doing so. Or indeed, left-wing critiques of capitalism and pursuits of socialist alternatives, which are, have a bit of resonance in the context of millennial socialism, seem to also produce high turnouts in elections when parties are divided on these questions, like in Britain, for example, between a Corbynite Labour a few years ago and a very different Conservative government. So whether it's from the right or from the left, I think you see plenty of evidence that we are at the very least divided souls on this question, that we have not left behind any interest in visions, ideas, transformation in politics. That can be a very dangerous sensibility. And of course, much of the historical justifications for capitalism have been about eradicating all the uncertainty and danger that comes with the attraction of high-minded ideals in politics. That sensibility is still there, but it's squashed on all sides, and it's exactly challenged by the sense of finite time that we started with. But I think it's premature to say that any political movement that tries to speak to it is just obsolete, is out of time.
Thank you very much. First of all, the idea of the society of grandparents, if it was only for this phrase, this is worse. Because being Bulgarian and because the grandmother is the only functioning institution in our country, I do believe it's a very positive message. But also this is interesting because I want to go to you for your questions and comments, but this idea of immortality, about personal immortality, about the children, was not the only way that people have been thinking about this. In the beginning of the 20th century, there was a very strange Russian religious philosopher called Nikolai Fyodorov, who basically believes that the only task in life is to resurrect your parents. The guy was, by the way, quite influential with people like Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, but his major story was society cannot live without war, and the only war that we can basically fight as humans is against death. And for him, the idea of the state was like a museum. Nothing should disappear. Everything should be preserved. And I'm saying this because I very much agree with you that this is an interesting story, and this cultural transformation is very much there. The economic man that was so much dominating in our understanding of the democratic politics is not there. Everybody these days, when talk about elections, they talk about vibes. I don't know exactly what it means, but obviously people know. But this is this interesting change, and this is why the talk about the future, and by the way, the idea that future and past are changing their times all the time, their places all the time. It's so interesting to discuss. You have your time, and please feel free to ask questions, to comment, to agree, to disagree. Jonathan is coming from a kind of appreciation for ideological politics. He's not afraid of heated debates. Please. Please, Albena.
So we were kind of pondering the world around this dichotomy. Either we consume the future now for the sake of comfort and habits of consumption, or we commit to some high-minded ideal. But what we see around us, for instance, with the student mobilization against the atrocities in Gaza, it is not very high-minded. It's not about what kind of wonderful world we're going to build once the war is over. It's not about Arab liberal democracy. Probably it will never come. But it is about the injustice of massive extermination of human life. So this kind of, and the students are not doing it because of being immortal in the hearts of the people. And still they're not comfortably sitting in their apartments. So it's not for glory, it is just a struggle against obvious injustice. So I'm wondering whether these kind of struggles, not high-minded, but struggles against injustice, are not going to deliver some sort of a future without these high-minded ideals. Hmm?
Jonathan.
Thank you. I mean, I think these kind of struggles are vital and indispensable, and I would be entirely sympathetic with them, including the cases you gave. I guess also in other cases to do with climate change, I think you see something similar. People acting precisely out of a sense of sheer urgency, sheer injustice, whether it's high-minded or whether it's simply desperation. I think it may often be the latter. And certainly my impulse is not to say that urgency is inherently mistaken in politics, that this type of intervention of last resort is something to be scorned. Of course not. And we live in a world with more than enough causes that should prompt this type of response to them. But I think maybe it's worth distinguishing, if you like, between the urgency of beginnings and the urgency of endings. Sometimes I feel, to take the climate change case again, that there is often a sense of both of those, that we have a critical window in which certain targets have to be achieved, and if we can only get to the other side, then in some sense we're there. We've avoided the worst. And I think it's this kind of urgency of conclusion which is, for me, more problematic than the urgency of we need to act now. Yes, in many cases we need to act now, but we cannot hope that it's a question of acting only for the next X number of months, years, even decades. Politics has no natural bookends to it, doesn't have any natural horizon to that extent. And if there is, I think, something one-sided about the urgency, the emergency politics that is widespread at the, not just at the governing level today, but in these kinds of popular mobilizations, it's perhaps the overweening emphasis on the urgency of beginning, which I think is entirely important, but then perhaps a sense that the indefinite project is not what it's about anymore. It's about achieving something tangible before 2030 or before 2050 or whatever. And I think what was interesting and at least potentially retrievable from older forms of left-wing organization, for example, is exactly indefinite projects, setting of goals which, equality, isms, anything that is associated with an ism, I think, has this kind of characteristic of being something that recedes over the horizon, is not likely to be, certainly one can't put a date on its likely completion. I think this is exactly what one needs to recapture in the case of both ecological movements, and I'm not saying that no one's doing this, clearly such movements exist, but many of those who have become at least elevated to prominence in public discourse tend to have less to say on that aspect and much more on the need to do certain things to a certain deadline to do with science. And I think that is the concern I would have. So yeah, the urgency of action is certainly, I think, not misplaced in a world of many genuine crises. But the hope to complete things to a deadline, as opposed to think in terms of permanent organization collectives that are meant to endure indefinitely rather than simply to achieve a particular identifiable goal at an identifiable time. That, I think, is what is much less prevalent and is something that all types of organization, including ones for racial justice, geopolitical transformation, ecological transformation, I don't think they can go far without that.
Can I make a point on this in other slightly radicalized? Because in a certain way, on moral ground, there is nothing to discuss. But there is the question, most of these movements are not in my name. They're not about the solution, because the solution is not easy. How this should end, what should be done. So you're saying, I don't want my government to be involved. For example, protesters in the American universities. But listen, the fact that the American government is not going to be involved is not solving the situation. Stopping the war, even if you're going basically to stop violence, is not basically the synonymous of getting any type of a peace on the ground. And from this point of view, what I see is a movement which are very strong kind of a moral reactions and moral comments to this type of injustice, but they don't commit themselves to any type of solution where basically right or wrong Jonathan is talking about. So from this point of view, this is very powerful on a moral level, but every 6 months you have a new explosion about some other injustice. So you're much more saying where you are, how you feel about the world, what you believe that you are just or unjust, and you're not doing this. And with ecological and particularly climate, there is also something which is very politically not easy. For example, anti-nuclear movement during the Cold War. Listen, it was much easier for two very simple reasons, at least in my reading. First, if there were going to be a nuclear war, we all are going to die in the same day. If you imagine the total nuclear. So from this point of view, there were no winners and losers. With climate, probably we're going to die one day, but some are going to die earlier than others. And certain parts of the world are going basically, at least for a while, to do better than others. And secondly, during the anti-nuclear movement, it was enough to tell the governments what not to do. Don't do it. And you have two kinds of powers to which you talk. You have the Soviets, you have the Americans. Now you should tell governments what to do. And here it's not easy to agree, neither within the ecological movement, nor in society as a whole. And mind you, this change also of a protest politics is very important. Because when it comes to stop something, the protest politics of the type you're talking about is very powerful. When you go to this much more ideological idea of what should happen in 20, 30 or 50 years, it's much more difficult, but sorry for taking time, and there was a question there, so please. Yes.
Thank you very much. I forgot it already. Urgency and emergency. I think that's something that came to my mind. There is in real political life, there's parties, there are organizations, there's social groupings, and once they exist, they have a tendency to be eternal, not to die. So they develop their own tryings to sustain. And one of the things they think, I do think they do, is to try and say, vote me now. So they try to make emergency out of urgency whenever they can. And I think that's something that's dominating our political situation in the moment, and maybe always in crisis. That's the dominating fact. So make something of this.
Yes, I think we clearly live in a world where the sense of emergency, and as you said, an emergency that is cultivated, is widespread. And you know, sometimes I say you can think in terms of emergencies of left and right and center in the present. There's emergencies of climate change, emergencies from the right-wing perspective to do with demographic replacement are clearly very prevalent, and indeed liberal centrist emergencies to do with the international rules-based order, as it's called. So it's a world of emergency politics, yet we disagree on what the emergencies of the present are. And of course, if there was convergence in interpretation, then you might say, well, just put the right people in charge, put the people with enough power. Or
I would even disagree that there were any emergencies. I think there's emergencies, but not really emergencies.
So I would argue that things tend to become emergencies when people doubt the capacity to address them. And to that extent, it's often a symptom of a sense of powerlessness, of weakness, at more than one level. So at the level of governments, as you say, much that one might encounter as an emergency is often something cultivated as such by those who want to govern it as an emergency, because maybe they can concentrate power in their own hands as a government, because they can expedite certain types of decision with less democratic scrutiny. But I think also because in the contemporary world of weakened sovereignty, of strengthened capitalist interests, and so on, even governments doubt their capacity to get certain decisions through, and a media environment that perhaps also consistently questions their credibility, and so invoke a kind of a discourse of emergency to justify what they're doing when almost any other legitimizing principle seems to be in question. At the same time, I think this kind of emergency sensibility doesn't just come from above. It comes partly because we face real material problems, so I wouldn't want to suggest that it's a kind of it's a fantasy. But I think it's because we face real material problems that at the same time many people feel they themselves cannot control, and they don't trust those in power to control. Things become a climate emergency, not because you don't think that you know what should be done. Plenty of people are well versed in climate science that indicates at least the parameters within which policy making should proceed. But if you doubt that there are parties willing to pursue this, governments willing to meaningfully do so on an international stage and build the coalitions necessary for it, that sense of impotence and sense of how to get a message into the public sphere in a world of government spokespeople having the capacity to dominate, or media, social media having the capacity to filter, encourages things to be phrased as emergencies, to accentuate the immediacy, the need to act now, but also the need to achieve now, to complete, coming back to the previous response I gave. So insofar as I guess the thrust of your question is, it's not just that we should be thinking about emergencies, but the politics of emergencies, the way in which things confront us as emergencies, then I agree that that is not a brute fact. That is something that I think has got everything to do with pathologies of contemporary democracy and the sense of impotence that that generates. So say, not just at the popular level, also at a governmental level, everyone doubts their capacity to do anything. Therefore, the only way to concentrate decision-making power briefly and to somehow cultivate legitimacy for action is to say necessity. We need to do it, and we need to do it now, and you can't afford to take a different line. But of course, that is, it may be self-defeating in terms of achieving actual desirable policy ends, and it's certainly democratically problematic insofar as if everyone shouts necessity, on what basis can you find legitimacy for decisions that cannot suit everyone at all moments? Again, coming back to the point that we disagree on what the emergencies of the moment are. So yeah, it's a big problem, but I would trace it in my book back to problems of the weakening of collective power, of parties, of people's willingness to see themselves implicated in representative politics.
Can I continue this question before? Because I'll do something unforgivable. I'll say something positive to the government. But the story is, it's not the problem with the emergencies that when the emergency is over, you look back and you don't see it as emergency anymore. If you have survived it, you don't believe that it was such a big problem. You remember basically the first 2 or 3 weeks of the pandemic where everybody was convinced that it's a big emergency. And now when 2 years or 3 years later you look back and you said, come on. And in a certain way, the governments are also in a trap. The better they're doing with the emergency, the less people believe it was an emergency.
Yes, there's often mentioned with pandemic politics, isn't it? That the more successfully you control the virus, then the more it seems like a scare story in the first place. Absolutely. But at the same time, part of the problem is often to see these things as emergencies and to then to sort of to see the calm after the storm as some type of new equilibrium. Whereas, of course, if it is simply a restoration of the status quo ante, it's not an equilibrium. And we have just lived through the proof of that if you've just come through something like an emergency. So frame something as an emergency, in other words, as a problem with a beginning, a sudden beginning, an ending, a kind of a restoration of equilibrium afterwards, and maybe already on the wrong foot. I think ideas of equilibrium generally are quite misleading in the present. And as a footnote for me, one of the problems of thinking of a green transition is exactly this idea that we might move to a new equilibrium on the other side of a kind of a period of upheaval. No, I think the condition of politics, especially from here on in, is likely to be persistent disequilibrium, things that are in flux. And you've got to organize with that in mind, but you've also got to put aside those types of formulation like that of the emergency, which encourage you to think of it in these terms of a kind of a bridge from one equilibrium to the next.
Thank you very much. There was a question there, please.
Thank you. You mentioned the revolution, for example, and the notion of the future, but I think, modern civilization 100 years ago also had a sense of frontier. Now, of course, today we consider it a colonial concept, maybe, but frontier can also be, technological frontier, digital, even possibly, geistlich. So I wonder if some kind of frontier can be maybe a solution to this crisis.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I guess instinctively I would share the suspicion that you also articulated, that most notions of frontier come laden with misleading assumptions. Spatial frontiers often come with the assumption of moving into empty space, of moving into a world which is lacking in people or lacking in civilization, to go back to kind of the colonial understanding of the frontier. I was reading recently an interesting book about the night as frontier. So I don't know if anyone's come across Murray Melbourne's book from the 1980s. It's basically trying to say we should think of the 24-hour cycle as something similar to a frontier dynamic whereby we are habitually people of the day, we're diurnal societies, and yet we have increasingly pushed the frontier into the night, first with electric lighting and the conquest of the evening, if you like, then increasingly with capitalist shift work, with the desire to have machines that are always running, factories that never stop, planes that are always in the sky, to kind of push temporarily into the night so that all of it is made productive. And there again, I mean, that's I think the use of the term frontier in this type of analysis is partly to alert us to the problems that come with this kind of with this approach, to alert us to what gets destroyed, nullified, what gets downplayed, undervalorized with the notion of colonization and frontier as they typically are paired with each other. So I'm afraid I'm probably more on the line of thinking that you anticipated, that frontier is a way of seeing the world that instinctively should raise concerns rather than be part of a progressive politics. But maybe that's just because I haven't thought these issues out enough. I'd be interested to hear about what a 21st century left-wing frontier politics might look like.
Thank you very much. There is a question here, but it's interesting if you go back to history to see that all the idea of the perfect societies, for example, utopia, it was not about the time. It was always about space that we don't know. There are islands that we have not discovered. The first time travelers appeared around in literature around the French Revolution. We start being interested in traveling in time exactly when kind of the space was already conquered, but please.
Okay, my question is about my own life and my 80 years on this earth. I see that people have become more selfish. I think that the people are consuming 2 cars, 3 cars. A nice house has to be had, vacations in Croatia or wherever. Everyone is very interested in the self. And I think that wasn't always true in the 50s and maybe the 60s when we protested against wars in Vietnam or the racial situation. I think we've lost that feeling of the other, the altruism. Your comments.
There was one question there because I want to be sure that everybody is going to ask, so because we have 10 more minutes, so I really want to harvest questions. So, okay, we are going to have one and one more. Yeah, please, it's you and then you, and we're back to Jonathan.
Thank you very much for the really interesting ideas you've been sharing so far. I was just thinking that sometimes it feels that there's a bit of a disconnect between competence and consequence. In that, for example, in the UK, we arguably had a very incompetent government for, say, the last decade, but they were deeply consequential, for example, with Brexit and sort of general erosion of institutions. You could perhaps apply a similar parallel in the US. Trump, incompetent, and yet his period in power, and there may yet be another one, has been deeply consequential in many different ways. What can we do to try to kind of bring those two concepts back together so that actually competent government can also be consequential government and obviously hopefully consequential in a positive direction?
Thank you. And there is one more question before we go back to Jonathan.
Thank you. This is an old argument. I'm thinking here especially of historian Jeff Ely and his work on pre-First World War socialists and their relationship to democracy. And the argument basically is that since democracy is nowadays universally bound to the nation-state form, this has limited the imaginable future of democracy. It has limited the way in which democracy can democratize itself or imagine democratizing itself to a more democratic form, right? So I wonder what you think about this argument that the universality of the nation-state form is kind of killing the futures of democracy.
Thank you. On whether people are getting more selfish, I mean, yeah, as I said before, I'm not convinced. I think in any individual, if we want to individualize the question, or socially running through societies, there are always counter tendencies going on at the same time. We live so I'm from London. London has seen protests in the last year of up to 1 million people on the street about questions of injustice in Gaza that has been mentioned by Albena earlier on. These are people who are not just at home consuming the leisure industry on a Saturday afternoon, but are exactly moved to kind of age-old political questions in their current pressing form. If one would want to say these are still minorities, they are large minorities. Are they even minorities? I would be very wary of thinking that one can put adjectives on people in a very general sense and say that people have become more greedy, more self-interested and so on. To the extent that they have more outlets for that type of behavior under current economic systems, they also, I think, regularly express dissatisfaction exactly with that point and look for outlets for something other than that, something more meaningful, something that is exactly less self-interested, and may even criticize other people for being self-interested. In other words, even in the logic of critique, if not in self-abscription. So I get what you're saying, and I guess I wouldn't want to say that we live in the world of 1945 where people have just been through a world historical shared catastrophe which surely alerted them to the social interdependence of individual fate and gave reason to pioneer things like, I don't know, the collectivization of a health service in Britain. I wouldn't want to overlook how much has changed in this time, but I would be wary that saying that we have moved towards being different kinds of people. I think we are people that retain exactly the capacity to criticize the ways in which we perhaps habitually do act in self-interested fashion. On questions of competence and consequence, I mean, for me, the problem with the last government in Britain, the Tory government, was not its incompetence. I mean, I think it goes a bit deeper than that. For me, I'd be wary to criticize them on terms of competence. These are people who have a vision of Britain, which is absolutely not one I share, and it's not a particularly developed vision. I wouldn't even say maybe it counts as a vision, but it's a willingness to prop up fading social and economic structures, often for the benefit of the existing wealthy in society, who often are donors to the Conservative Party and sadly also the Labour Party. But this is, I don't think, a question of competence or incompetence. This is parties which are in the hock of special interests that are anything but democratically and publicly minded. So for me, it's about not so much kind of bringing competence back to the capacity to leave long-lasting decisions. Most decisions will have that kind of lasting aspect to them, whether we like them or not. But it's, I think, exactly to contest both the malevolence, the misguidedness, the self-interestedness of our political adversaries, while still recognizing them as somehow participants in the democratic game. But for me, competence, if it comes down to competence, then we're already working within the existing structures of society, because competence is how well you manage the existing system, essentially, rather than your capacity to imagine something very, very different. For me, that is a quality that goes beyond competence towards something like imagination, collective power, a whole other range of attributes, which I think we need just as much as we need competence. And then the question about the nation state. I do think if the nation state is kind of the horizon of our ethical and political objectives, then ultimately no good is going to come of that. And the equation of democracy with a nation state may have been progressive for a while in the undoing of empires and colonial forms, but it's not a place to rest too long, because it's not an equation which I think ultimately has long-term progressive implications. At the same time, I would say, I think part of the reason why a lot of that sense of finality, of lack of confidence in the future is present today, is because even the nation state doesn't seem to be particularly secure as a political form. The separation of powers across so many institutions in the European Union, for example, so I'm not a Eurosceptic, I'm not a Brexiteer, I'm much more for a kind of federal democratic Europe, but the current form that we have of the European Union, of many different institutions competing in particular functional areas to control particular functional policy-making concerns, central banks, functional agencies of the Commission, and so on. Exactly this fragmentation of authority, I think, also creates that sort of loss of confidence in the future that I'm describing, because if the nation state had anything to be said for it, at least it was that kind of notion of the community of fate extending into the future, bigger than the sum of the individuals alive at a particular moment. We're losing, I think, that as well. I'm not nostalgic for that. I don't have much faith that nationalism can be a progressive force in the present. But I think it's also the weakening of nationalism and its equation with the democratic state, which is part of the uncertainty of the present. And we need to build something out of that which is not the democratic nation state again, but some type of transnational political project instead.
Thank you very much. Listen, we did what we could. You have a conversation between a concerned optimist and a cheerful pessimist, so let's applaud the optimist.